Welcome to your digital lesson. You are going to watch this video, and I'm also going to tell you when to pause this video and to click over for the video clips. So please, I'm going to suggest that you watch this within Canvas so you can go back and forth quickly. After you watch this video and the video clips, there is going to be a short 4-question quiz at the end of class, and then you are free to go. Hope you guys have a good weekend. All right, so we're talking about the 1980s. Today we're going to be talking about some major social issues and events. Continuing just a little bit about economics and social issues. In 1981, in the first year of Reagan's administration, the air traffic controllers went on strike. So these are the people who are up in the tower at the airport who make sure that the nation's planes fly and land and take off safely. They had been negotiating for months for higher wages and a shorter work week. They wanted a 32-hour work week, which sounds really, really nice. They wanted better retirement benefits, and they said, if we don't get these things, we will go on strike. The president had been negotiating with them for months, trying to convince them to not go on strike. This would completely shut down the nation's trade and travel. But they decided in the summer of 81 to go on strike. About 13,000 of them went on strike. There were only 17,000 of them working. Reagan said, all right, that's fine. You have 48 hours. Otherwise, you will be terminated. Because technically, they were federal employees. They worked for the FAA, the Federal Aeronautics Administration. Is it aeronautics? Hold on. It's not aeronautics, it's the Federal Aviation Administration. I'm so sorry. So Reagan gives them this ultimatum, and he says, that's fine, you don't have to work here. And those of you who are not going to come back, you can't work for the federal government ever again. So 11,000 people were fired. Only about 2,000 of the air traffic controllers came back. And many people tried to say that this was because Reagan was anti-union, which is not really the case. In the 40s and 50s, he spent several years as the president of the Screen Actors Guild, which is a union. And here you can see him testifying in those McCarthy hearings back in the 50s. So from Reagan's perspective, he was not anti-union. He was just trying to protect the country at large. But many people would still say this demonstrates that he doesn't care about the regular person. He doesn't care about the blue collar and the lower class workers, but two sides to every story. Another thing we see in the 1980s is a change in immigration. Starting in the 1970s, there was definitely a shift away from European immigration to Asian immigration, especially Southeast Asian immigration. The two main groups in the 70s and early 80s were Vietnamese, who about just under 200,000 Vietnamese were brought over with the fall of Saigon in 1975, and also with Cambodians. They were trying to escape the regime of the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot. I want you to watch the video about Cambodian refugees. The other place where we started to see a lot of refugees in the 1980s was from Latin America, especially Mexico, but definitely other places throughout. And many of them were coming as illegal immigrants. This was never a phrase until the 1980s. So new laws were created in the mid-1980s that had to do with how are we going to deal with these illegal immigrants. One part of these new laws meant that any employers who hired illegal or unauthorized workers would be fined and possibly face criminal charges. It would increase border enforcement, and we see the issues surrounding this about building a wall, and it would grant citizenship to those who had illegally immigrated, but only after a certain number of years, 5 or 6 years. But this was absolutely part of my growing up. I grew up in San Diego, about a 30-minute drive from the border, and I remember seeing these signs growing up on the freeway. So this was definitely a thing in the 80s and the early 90s of people desperately wanting to come to America because of their own issues in Latin and Central America. And we'll talk about that next week. And it is the Immigration Reform and Control Act that had those three elements of sanctions against employers, increased border enforcement, and granting citizenship after several years. One of the biggest issues was the AIDS crisis. This started showing up in 1981, and it was only happening amongst homosexual men. So it was often called a gay cancer or a gay plague. This definitely led to a stigma around this. Of course, the very conservative elements of America and the church said that this was a plague or this was punishment for immoral behavior. It started popping up a lot in New York City, and they began testing it and trying to find out about it and understanding what was causing this and what could be done for it. It wasn't until about 1983 that opinions began to change a little bit. There was two things. There was an outbreak in Central Africa in both men and women. So that started to change perspectives that maybe this wasn't just a homosexual issue. There also were cases of women in America getting it. And so the study started suggesting maybe it wasn't just a sexually transmitted issue. So they started studying how is this problem, how is this disease, this virus, transmitted between people. One person who helped publicize this was Ryan White. He was an 11-year-old boy who contracted AIDS. He was born with hemophilia, so he would regularly get blood transfusions, and he contracted AIDS through contaminated blood. As more information was found, it was found that you could get it through sex, through unprotected sex, through blood transfusions, through doing drugs, through shared needles, and now we have even more information about how it is spread because we understand things, we know how to protect ourselves. Again, as testing continues, as studies continue, they gave a name to the virus that caused this autoimmune deficiency, and they called it human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. So the virus, you can have the virus, but you might not get hugely sick until you contract AIDS. You're not really going to get AIDS without having the HIV virus. One thing that started to change in the mid-80s is a shift in the stigma about AIDS and calling for more research to be done. And this was done at a grassroots level, but it also happened in a very public arena. The movie star Elizabeth Taylor, I forgot her name there for a second, Elizabeth Taylor, who was in Cleopatra in the 1960s, she was in the movie National Velvet in the 1940s, real famous Hollywood actress, and she started speaking out for raising money for AIDS research. One of her very close friends, the Hollywood actor Rock Hudson, he contracted AIDS and he died in 1985. So this was very famous. And then in the very late 80s, Freddie Mercury, from the lead singer of the band Queen, was also someone who contracted the disease and died. So all of these people were trying to bring awareness to the public so that the public could protect themselves, and also for funding for research and hopefully medication. Right now I want you to pause this and watch the video about the AIDS crisis. It's titled Ending the Epidemic. Then come on back to this video. All right, so even today, AIDS is still a thing. It is still spread through drug use, through unprotected sex, as well as all throughout Africa. This is still an epidemic. And it is also very connected to the war on drugs. This was in the 1980s. The president nominated a drug czar, someone who would be in charge of dealing with this issue. Several reasons why the drug war was a thing. Partly because of AIDS, because it became so apparent that illegal drug use was causing problems. But there also was a fear about crime, especially in the inner city. First Lady Nancy Reagan was really important in the Just Say No campaign, just like Michelle Obama has been very important in the healthy foods movement. Nancy Reagan was all about discouraging drug use. A very famous campaign was the DARE campaign. And what happened in President Reagan's administration was that a lot of drug use was criminalized, which meant that drug users would then be arrested, got them off the streets, tried to get the drugs off the streets, but that then also crowded the prison. So with every action, there is a reaction. Some people look at this and say it was too harsh, and it created and started to create a lot of the problems we have of overcrowding in the prison system today. Now I want you to watch the public service announcements from the 80s and then come back to the video. The last topic today is the shuttle program. Now, we talked about how the space program was created in the late 1950s and into the 1960s. We landed on the moon in July of 1969. And in the 70s, it was decided we needed a program that had reusable safe spacecraft, because with the Apollo program, there was so much that was wasted. So the space shuttle was almost like a plane. It would go up on rocket boosters, and then it would re-enter almost like a plane would land at an airport, just with a few more elements added in. One of the most famous shuttles was the Challenger. The Challenger, its most famous expedition was in January of 1986. There were 6 crew members plus a 7th named Krista McAuliffe, and she was a school teacher, and this was a really big deal. She had entered this contest and applied and gone through all this testing, and she would be teaching science classes from space. So this was very public. The country was excited about this. But in January of 1986, there were several weather problems at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, in Central Florida. So the launch of the Challenger was pushed back almost a week because of some frost and some other issues. But then finally, on January 28th, Challenger was launched. And less than about 2 minutes later, Challenger exploded. So once you watch the video, it shows the live footage. And then come on back to this video. This was kind of shocking because the world, or at least Americans, were watching this live. And school children were watching it live. And President Reagan gave a speech that evening and gave a special message to those kids. So why don't you watch that? And once you finish watching the Reagan video, you can close this video. If you still have time before class is over, you have a few options. You can go back and rewatch parts of this video and take notes, or there are a couple other videos in the video clips section that you might be interested in. Then at about 11:05, Mr. Buckmiller is going to give you a quick quiz just so I can make sure that you were paying attention. All right, that's it. Bye-bye.